MJ also said that they're going to be moving the screen around for us. So sometimes if one of y'all are speaking, they'll move it over. I don't know if y'all caught that earlier, but I have no control over that. Hello and welcome to Translations, the Seattle Transgender Film Festival. I'm Jett Garrison, a writer, director, and host of Trunkle Jet, where I chat with queer and trans creatives. And I am very excited to host this Trans MASC Creatives panel with this amazing group of writers, directors, storytellers, actors, artists. And I'm going to introduce our panelists now, and then we'll get into our chat because we have so many amazing topics to cover in a short amount of time. Chase Joynt, who is our co-director of this year's opening night film, No Ordinary Man, the documentary about jazz musician Billy Tipton that has been hailed by IndieWire as the future of trans cinema. Chase also directs TV, most recently an episode of Two Sentence Horror Stories for the CW. I'm only going to be covering a blip of what each one of these folks does. So we're going to continue with Amos Mac. In addition to co-writing No Ordinary Man, Amos has worked across unscripted, documentary, and dramatic series, including Amazon's Transparent, Viceland's Gaycation, and most recently as story editor for the HBO Max series Gossip Girl. Marquise Vilsón is an actor, producer known for The Kitchen, Blind Spot, Ben is Back, and of course, No Ordinary Man. Marquise was featured in the wonderful documentary Disclosure, which you have to see if you have not yet, which is an in-depth look at Hollywood's depiction of transgender folk and the impact of those stories on transgender lives in America and beyond. Cal Calamia's short film Projecting is playing in the Trans Joy program, and joy is such a good word to describe that film as part of this year's Translations Festival. His book of poetry, San Fran Shit Show, was published in February by Nomadic Press, and we are super thrilled to have him here with us. And sadly, our fifth panelist, award-winning singer, songwriter, actor, performer, and writer, Ryan Cassata, had a family emergency and is not able to join us today. And he does send his warm regards, and we do wish him well. So welcome everyone to our panel today, this evening. I wanted to start off with a quick question that I hope that each one of you can answer for us. And then we'll just kind of go around and kick off some questions on the topic, specifically about being a trans MASC creative, storyteller, however you want to identify. And I think something that, we get asked a lot, and so it's kind of a softball, but for folks who maybe haven't seen you speak before or are newer to your work, can you tell me, the first time that you saw yourself or you felt like you saw someone on screen that resembled yourself, and how did that help you on your own journey? And Marquise, I would love to start with you. I feel like you and I may be the elder statesman of the room.
I suspect you might be close. So the first time that I saw myself in media, I would say in the 90s, of course, during the talk show circuit, that would have to be Reno Wright Prestige, who was on Jerry Springer. That was the first time that I had seen someone who was assigned female at birth, trans MASC identified, that was Black on TV. That was the first Black trans man, visible Black trans man in media I had ever seen. I don't think that there was anyone else prior to Reno. So.
Yeah. And some of that was also covered in Disclosure about how, significant that was at the time, as problematic as it was too. But it was all we had back then, as you pointed to.
Oh, absolutely. The time was totally different. I remember that episode. It was 1997. I was 16. I was just discovering my own transness and finally walking in my own truth. And yeah, there were no roles. There were no opportunities in this regard. Transness wasn't necessarily celebrated, right? There was no incentive, if you will, to be a trans person at that time. So I acknowledge Reno as kind of like one of those very brave soldiers who kind of walked into, a really dangerous situation. I think particularly at a time when visibility literally was not celebrated. In fact, I mean, you were heavily scrutinized. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so powerful. And a specific question: where were you growing up at that time in your life?
The Bronx. So I grew up here in New York City. I grew up in the Bronx. And yeah, also he was a part of ballroom culture. He had been in the scene, I think at that time, maybe since 93. And I had just joined the ballroom community in 1995. So I'd seen him for 2 years and never had a conversation with this person. So I think it was just that much more impactful because we were so close in proximity, but we never had a conversation. Also, he's like maybe 10 years older than me. And that was the boundary that you would cross, you know, not for younger, you know, sort of new entering ballroom participants, you know, talking to somebody who essentially at that time was practically legendary. It wasn't the thing to do. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also something that as we go around, and Chase, I'd like to hear from you next. I think the region of the time and where you were in those moments is also significant. So same question for you, Chase, and if you can place us, you know, once upon a time when Chase first saw himself or something.
Sure. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to chat with all of you. And, you know, my once upon a time story is located at UCLA in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was in a queer performance class, and I was a Butch Dyke identifying, corduroy pant wearing, back of the class sitting human. And I wasn't a particularly syllabus stalking student, and in walked Kate Bornstein to the front of my class that day. And Kate was on tour with a book, and in the middle of her performance, she dropped the register of her voice, and she looked out into the class and she said, did that do anything to help you figure me out? And I thought, why, yes, it did. And of course, what I didn't recognize in that moment was that Kate was drawing our attention to all of the transphobic expectations that we put on trans people to help us make sense of them in public. But in that moment, Kate was the first, you know, trans identified performer, artist, activist who I had ever knowingly encountered. And it totally transformed my capacities to think about transness and gender nonconformity in my own body and in my own life and in my own politics. And right around that same time, I was an activist at UCLA, and I was organizing around sexual and gender-based violence. And that organization, that little hub, was part of the LGBTQ Studies Center. And the meetings that we had were in the same room as the trans meetup group the hour prior. And I was not ready to be in that room as a part of that group, but boy, was I happy to watch those people walk in and out of that room. And it took me a long time to start having those conversations, but those were really the formative moments for me.
Oh, yes, the toe tipping moments and trying to figure out when to dip our toes into those spaces, definitely. Amos.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me. First time I saw myself reflected in the media, I'd have to say, you know, I'm focusing more on masculinity here and the type of human I saw as a 6-year-old child in Augusta, Georgia, my parents stealing HBO somehow. This was the 80s when you could like get HBO in a weird, wire it a certain way. And watching Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and that Pee-wee Herman was someone that I connected with on a level that I just didn't get at the time, but it all makes sense now in terms of his masculinity, his like, he gives off this like a queer vibe, and he's also super comfortable with himself in a way where in the films, he, you know, was who he was. He presented the way that he was in this like little suit, but also like his mannerisms and the way that he was kind of ridiculous and, you know, strange guy, but people didn't mess with him really. He was, you know, people respected him. He had, you know, love interests, and he had friends. And that was something that I, you know, vibed with at an early age and always looked up to him.
Wow. Kind of like the queer Mr. Rogers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Cal, for yourself as well.
Hi. Yeah, so great to be here. I have to, well, I'm 24, so we'll start there. Some of what you're saying, I'm like, I don't know what y'all are talking about.
So I'm muting to laugh at you.
Thank you. I really needed that validation. And I honestly, I was pretty young when I first saw She's the Man. So hear me out. She's the man. I was just like, what's going on? This is an AFAB person really dressing as a dude, and it's working. And I know that that's not really a depiction of transness, but something about it really, like, I held on to, and I was obsessed with that movie. And I was obsessed with that movie long before I had any idea what trans was. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, I see it. I see what I was like kind of experiencing, but not fully grasping. But I grew up outside of Chicago, so Illinois, and I went to school in Missouri. And so it was a very Midwestern, like there wasn't a ton of conversation, but I was the president of the GSA, also as like a super sporty lesbian at the time. And Laverne Cox was our speaker, a keynote speaker for an event we put on. And so, yeah, I met her and I was like, whoa, I think, yeah, that was really awesome. But still, again, transmasculine representation, I think, was far less than transfeminine representation. And so I don't actually have a pivotal like person who I feel like was the first one that I saw that I identify really closely with.
And that's, that is such a fair and valid answer, because what we're all talking about is time and place and where we are in our own journey and what we're seeing, right? Because visibility is key. Marquise, I was watching something of yours and you used that word legendary, of talking about what is the future for seeing ourselves. Can you speak more to why you chose? Because it was one of those things like, the Netflix thing, pick one word to talk about what the future is. And you were, thinking about it and you chose legendary. And it was so beautiful because we hear that word in a variety of places, but can you speak to what that meant for yourself in that moment?
I recall, so I was searching for the word legacy. That's what it was. It was for disclosure. I remember this. And so for me, it is about making sure that I think it's MASC, folks, that we do have some kind of legacy. I don't know that to be something that has always been inherently very tangible to us. There are some very few stories. I think also race plays a really big part in that. Thinking about that from the Black experience and thinking about seeing Black trans masculinity throughout the years. And so, yeah, legacy is something I think is really important for us to kind of be carving out now in these moments. Thinking about what the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years is going to be like for the next generation, not having to dig and sift through all of these things. I mean, the eras obviously from which we come, it was like you go to the library, right? Like I remember when I stumbled upon Stone Butch Blues and Trans Warriors. I remember when I stumbled upon Lauren Cameron's Body Alchemy. And just thinking about even the references that I'm using right now in this moment, they happen to be white. And so this is just a really honest sort of observation, you know what I mean, like assessment of my own experience. And so I think it's extremely important that each of us are all doing that thing. And I must admit, particularly as a Black person, I'm very invested in legacy in that way, because we really just don't have enough contextualized history. But shout out to C. Riley Snorton, who's always doing the work to make sure that people know about Black queer history just in general. But yeah, that was why I chose the word legacy, because we need more of it. We need traditions to honor,
Yeah, I mean, and so much of what you're speaking to is, who has access, who has privilege, and it is white supremacy. I mean, for across the board with visibility and access to storytelling. Also, I think what each one of you pointed to is the dearth of trans mask of center type characters or stories for us to gravitate towards. And that brings me to another question I think is specific for this group of folks and for I think our larger trans mask storytelling community. And I use that word trans mask as an umbrella, but even in the past 3 years, seeing the language that we're using ebb and flow and be embraced and rejected, from trans masculine to trans man to man of trans experience to mask of center. There are many feelings around these words that we choose and in the stories that we tell and the characters that embrace them. And I'm sure I'm missing a few. How do you navigate, and this is going to be a question for each one of you, how do you navigate this language in your own work? As you're writing or as you're coming to projects, if you're an actor, and you're seeing certain language used. If you have a specific example you want to share, or if you've come to, okay, right now in this time and place, this is how I'm going to use the language that feels appropriate for either myself or this character. And I don't know, Amos, if you want to talk to that, because I know you and I are both in, television writers' rooms. And sometimes this topic comes up in a more quote unquote mainstream environment than I think our wonderful siloed, but sometimes echo chambers can be amongst our fellow queer or trans creatives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I know with my solo projects and scripts that I write that are, not for a writer's room, but for my own, my own samples, I often use a conversation about language between characters. That's one way that I acknowledge, intergenerational trans characters or queer characters. It's something that is interesting to me, so I like to acknowledge that and have it, and that's how I feed it in, and because not everybody uses the same language. Not everybody. We're all coming from different points of view, even if some of us are the same age. Communities are different, despite being in part of an umbrella community, right? The trans community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, specifically, yeah. And Cal, for our youngest member in the room, and I appreciate you outing your age to us, because ageism in Hollywood is real on both sides.
So, well, my interaction with language is largely, I use trans MASC all the time, and that's what I feel like I see the most and I feel comfortable with. I think we're all making the point that it depends who you are and how your relationship with your transness, how you want that to be named. And so I think, to the point that was just made about kind of integrating that conversation into the work, I think that makes a lot of sense. For me personally, I think I prefer any terminology that acknowledges manhood and transness, and whatever that looks like feels right to me. But I think continuing to acknowledge it and just bring in that conversation wherever possible is what makes sense.
Yeah. And Chase, this also was a bit of a thread in the film No Ordinary Man. And as you were telling that story, as y'all were as a group telling that story, feel free to speak to that specific example, but you have a large body of work of exploring some of this.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think, Marquise, I'm thinking immediately of that incredible conversation that you had in the casting room that doesn't arrive in our film. Of course, there's so many conversations that don't make it on screen. And there was this remarkable moment where Marquise and I share a birth year and a relation to certain kinds of trans MASC early community making and references. And we were in conversation with someone who was 19 and who was looking at us and was sort of recognizing the kind of incredible change and difference in our experiences. But I think that, I really locate No Ordinary Man as one of many docs about transmasculinity that are thinking by and through a cohort and really pushing back against an individual or a single story. And I think by always thinking in multiples, we get to trouble and spend time with language within the film itself. And so it becomes less a question of how do we imagine Billy Tipton would have identified and what words would he have used, and instead think what's at stake when we try to claim someone, or what's at stake when we're using language when finding people in history. And, one of the brilliant parts of Marquise's work in our film too is a connection between portrait documentaries about transmasculinity. So that work was being done in The Aggressives in 2005. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a butch, a stud, an aggressive, right? These are very specific community-based words that signal different kinds of alliances and allegiances. And so how can we always be thinking not only across generations, but across texts? And I think that gets us out of some of the, to me, less interesting conversations about right and wrong, and instead thinking always contextually and within community.
No, that's a wonderful perspective there, because I think there was a time when, we ran the risk of policing one another too much. And I think that having these dialogues, is super important. I want to, with a specific question, Marquise, I'm curious for yourself as an actor and in working with your reps, how has this language maybe changed for you, or conversations with them on how sometimes they want to lean into quote unquote market you to the industry? What has that been like?
I think it's been very trial by error. I think part of it is, one, that this experience is very new for me. I think particularly as an actor for the last 4 years, but also these roles that we're seeing, particularly for like trans men, are also really new. And I think that my team is trying to like, they're negotiating, navigating that pretty much at the same time as I am. Because also I do have, I hate this kind of language, but like I have cis assumed privilege, right? So like there's other kinds of roles that I can walk in for, I can definitely go in for. But I think from when I started working with my reps in 2017 up until now, I think it's changed in terms of specifically the kinds of roles that are coming up, right? Like not every trans MASC role is going to be quote unquote the right role. Not every Black cis male presenting role is also going to be the right role just because I'm Black, right? Like, so I think it's just kind of like these ongoing conversations that we have to continue to have and really figure out exactly like what makes sense and what doesn't, But I think right now in this moment, just in this industry, and I think for all of us, these are really new conversations to be having. The idea that there would somehow not only just see like a Black trans masculine series regular role coming up for Brian Michael Smith, and now that's rolling out into a show like 4400. I mean, the idea that that's happening within a 2-year time span seems fast, right? And then there's also the particulars about what that means for whoever that person is going to be a Black trans masc person working, on the set, working in proximity to cisness, working in proximities, to white folks, all those things. Like a lot of it, I think, is just new. We're all kind of trying to figure out what that is. I don't know that we have the answer, me or my team, more than we're kind of learning as we go and learning how to trust each other and doing that kind of work, figuring out what makes the most sense. In this particular moment, I can say for myself, I'm very interested in working definitely with Black creatives, and not only because of my own Blackness, which is clearly true, but I think in thinking about what it means to be a Black trans person in this country, experiencing violence per Black communities, and also thinking about violence when it does happen within community, right? Like Black trans femmes typically experience violence at the hands of Black men. And I think that those conversations definitely need to still be happening with like Black communities, which I don't necessarily see, as much of. I know I'm kind of like all over the place, but I also feel like this conversation and the way that all these things are happening in China, it really is. It's a lot to try to attack, if you will, at like one time. But for me and my team, we're kind of just taking it one day as we go and figuring out what feels right and what necessarily doesn't.
No, you're hitting on so many aspects of it and the intersectionality that comes with so much of it. And I think you're absolutely right. Like this is very new. I would say just in the past 2 to 3 years for, it's a bit of a wave, right, for trans MASC characters, because there was a smattering, a few side characters here and there, maybe 5, 6 years ago. And I'm speaking in the mainstream television episodic world. But I think what you just hit on, and especially, in looking at trans MASC characters and looking at Black trans MASC characters, it boils down to the creatives, the executives who are creating these shows. And I think we're just now at a point where some of the creatives are getting to a place of prestige or power where they're able to start pushing the envelope for some of the executives who maybe are a little wary. They don't know what to do with this yet. And so they're having to then put trust in the storytellers who have not only the talent and skill, but the credibility and the life skill to tell these stories. Chase, for yourself, and looking at perhaps writing or directing in quote unquote the episodic space, what has been some of the conversations you've been having to position yourself more in that space? Because I know that you're kind of straddling both fields as far as hybrid documentary and navigating that, but are you finding any obstacles of moving more towards episodic?
Yeah, I have a very promiscuous relationship to genre and form, and was approached by the team at Two Sentence to think about an episode about a young transmasculine high school kid who gets bullied. And the creative team of that show knew very clearly that they wanted to cast a young transmasculine actor, and that there was no way to tell the story without trans leadership. And it was an exciting opportunity to think what's possible in the scripted space. How can we actually think about the genre traps of horror to tell a really grounded story about the stakes for trans youth in the contemporary moment? And that for me felt like a perfect storm of opportunity, which is leveraging a kind of studio and industrial power, but be thinking about that story through a kind of documentary social activist mechanism and mindset. And through that, I was able sort of to arrive on set and say, the stakes of telling a story like this and the stakes of making these kinds of choices are vast. And, we have a chance here to do something differently. And I felt really excited by the opportunity to get really specific from the beginning and to really think, well, if we're going to tell this story from a trans POV, what does that look like? Not only based on what the camera sees, but everything behind the camera as well, right? And so it's really setting up the stakes on a variety of different levels. And I'm excited by those opportunities, but it really is grounded in a very, documentary, unscripted, social activist ethic.
Yeah. It's, at the core, we're all storytellers, right? And then it's figuring out where you leverage the specific medium that you're telling the story in. And, I love that you're talking about and being promiscuous in the different styles and genres, because, people are saying, a film like No Ordinary Man is a new form, the future of trans storytelling. Do you feel that for yourself? And maybe this is a question for you and Amos as well, because I think that can be a buzzword. I mean, that's a very huge, huge steps to put up there. How did you feel about that quote?
I mean, it's a hell of a pull quote that works really well on a poster, right?
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful. And, I think that the work that Jude Dry does at IndieWire is extraordinary and is very queer and trans focused. And I'm grateful for the opportunity. But, I don't know. Let's put the question about how I feel about that quote aside and say, okay. My mom is really happy that it's on a poster. But, I can say that the most exciting parts of that project to me are about elevating the unbelievable trans talent that exists and using the apparatus of a well-funded documentary to be thinking together about what's at stake in telling these stories. And so what does it mean to have pre-conversations with Marquise where we think what's possible here? How do we use this space to have conversations that feel valuable to us both for different reasons together and apart? What does it mean that Amos and I came up together in San Francisco, at a time where we didn't actually really know each other, but we're moving in spaces that really shaped who we were as young transmasculine people. And then how does that arrive on screen when Amos is identified by one of our actors as such a formative and hugely significant person in his own right? How do we use the apparatus of documentary to create opportunities for different kinds of world building? And that for me is the most, I hope, is the most enduring legacy of that project.
Well, and there's that word legacy again. I had a friend over the other day, Amos, and I had the original plumbing book out, on my coffee table, and they were flipping through, what is this? I'm like, oh, you don't know. But that moment, it is such a special moment. And we were talking before we began about, passing the torch and sharing our stories and being mentored up and, mentoring in some ways as we're telling these stories. And Amos, you are a part of what is considered part of our queer storytelling canon, right? If you will, if you start looking at that publication, what was that moment for you?
I mean, honestly, it was very endearing and unexpected. And at the same time, I was like, this is on camera, right? It felt so beautiful and perfect for the film. I was in the moment, and, I love Alex, and I had known Alex for years too, because I had interviewed him for Candy Magazine, a fashion periodical out of Madrid that is beautiful, giant, very fashion based, but also they call it transversal. So it has lots of like a lot of play with gender, but also trans creatives and models in there as well. So I knew him from like probably 2010 when I interviewed him for that. But to hear him say that about Original Plumbing and having like an impact on his life, it's also surprising because like sometimes I feel like I created that, Rocco and I created that magazine in a bubble, so to speak, where we were like working very closely together for so long and putting it into the world, like mailing it, ourselves. And then you see what people say online and, the beautiful feedback you get, but also it still doesn't feel, it's something else when someone says it to your face, so it was a beautiful moment for me, memorable.
You could see the wheels turning in your head. You're like the receiving, but then also the storyteller in your head is also like
you're getting this, right? Keep filming.
Well, and speaking of moments like that, now Cal, and seeing a film like No Ordinary Man or Disclosure, or films that are, really looking at the cloth of trans stories and characters that have come before all of us. How is your reception of that? How does it affect you, not only as a person, but as a creative, as a poet, as an up and coming filmmaker, which that word is so weird, but I can't wait to see what you create to the body, to the rest of your career.
Yeah, well, the movie was amazing, and as I've been on T for like 2 years, so I struggle sometimes to cry in the way I used to be able to cry. That was jerking tears like nothing. Like floodgates were open. It was so emotional. All of it was so emotional. Just to like kind of go through Billy Tipton's story, but also to just kind of see all of y'all. Like even just the parts where it's like, oh, here's a bunch of like trans MASC people in a room talking to each other. I'm like, oh wow, hey everybody, it's amazing. And some people that I've like seen before, some that I'm not super familiar with, but just to see that exists is huge. So I think it was like twofold. I was really emotional about the story itself, but I was also really emotional about watching all of y'all and so many people just interpret the story, and it with such care. And yeah, I was really touched by the part where his son is kind of grappling with he's very much grappling with everything for the duration of the film, and the way that y'all speak to him, and he kind of has a shift of perspective. And it just, to me, is so telling of the fact that as we make more space for just transness, trans masculinity, or what have you, we can kind of just like give some grace and some love, though it's a little overdue, but for stories that, existed before. And so maybe that space clearly wasn't there back then, but the fact that we're making it and honoring it now feels huge. So it just felt really, really emotional for me. And in terms of affecting my own work, I think the biggest thing is seeing, like, whether it's literature or film or whatever it is, seeing it and seeing trans MASC representation makes me feel like there's space for me to write things and there's space for me to create things, and that, even if it's not landing with everyone right now, in time, maybe it will. So yeah, thank you, all of y'all.
Well, I think one of a few things that y'all all share in common is that in your work, you're straddling that line of being both behind and in front of the camera, right? Being part of telling the story that you're telling, but also being in front of the camera telling the story. And Cal, I'm throwing this back at you to start this off, and the film that you have at this festival, that's you being raw, what was that moment that you decided that was what you wanted to do?
Yeah, that's it for me, really. I think like reclaiming what it is to be trans by just being trans and then existing. And I recently wrote a poem about this too, because it's funny, when we were going through like what should we do, we just wanted to depict kind of our relationship, because we don't really see that super often, like a kind of straight looking relationship, but with transness in it, and like how does the queerness show up and how does it not, and what matters. And ultimately we were just like, let's show what it looks like to be us for 2 minutes. And we had a back and forth about like maybe the mirror, and then there was this moment where like, we're not putting a mirror scene in this. There's no mirror scene. Like we had to really go through like what tropes like do we want to, you know, make sure to avoid when we're creating something that, you know, yeah, is telling a story that feels authentic, but without, you know, falling into some of those roles that aren't necessarily even true for a lot of trans people. Did I answer the question?
100%. I think you're also speaking to joy, finding trans joy. And this is almost becoming a bit of a buzzword in some of the circles I'm in right now, but I don't care. I think it's a wonderful buzzword for us to be having right now. And, you know, there's a similar, you know, moments in An Ordinary Man. And Marquise, when you're talking about, you know, the audition, and I love that dialogue, Chase and Amos, that y'all created of the actors coming in and having the dialogues and having, you know, the thoughts of what was Billy thinking in those moments. And that moment, Marquise, where you're like, oh, so this is, you know, where he is, and in this moment, and bringing yourself as an actor to be part of the creation, because it really is a hybrid in many ways, right? How often do you get to have that kind of dialogue in other projects that you're a part of?
In that way, not very often. Yeah, not very often. Yeah, I mean, in this business, it's, you know, it's pretty quick, right? Like people don't have time to do a lot of like conversation and explain things and allow you to have the room and grace to like process what you're going through. This was a really unique experience, and that I actually could have an open conversation, even if some of what that was felt like a rant. I think the moment, you know, because it was very unplanned, it was unrehearsed, it was just showing up into a space and kind of working what was specifically in front of me. But no, that is not like a regular thing. I would probably say Peter Hedges is the only cis white male director that I've had that kind of experience with, where like it was a lot more personal, and like a lot more time kind of spent during the audition. But that's pretty rare.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to is having those right kind of creatives and execs, you know, the ones that actually call themselves are, you know, cis allies, and who are actually using the word allied as a verb, right? An allied action, to really listen to us, which, to your point, hasn't happened as much. Do y'all feel like that is starting to happen more? And some of the dialogues you're having pitching your next project. And I don't know, Chase or Amos, if you want to speak to this, and what you're working on now, and having those meetings with certain executives, what kind of reception or openness do you feel like is happening now that maybe wasn't even a year ago? Maybe.
I don't know if I can't pinpoint really a year's difference in terms of like what, in general, I just want to say that I feel that there needs to be more trans creative executives, people in the studio, people in the network who are trans. You know, yes, we have cis allies everywhere, apparently, but I don't know if there are trans people who are executives, or if I just have not met them, or, you know, but that would be a huge asset. That would be really cool, because, you know, there's as a writer, you know, there's like the back and forth with the executives on projects, and in writers, you know, with different drafts of, you know, you get notes and everything. So it would be really awesome to have that kind of, you know, trans voice, trans point of view coming from that direction, instead of feeling like you're the only one in the room.
There are a few that are making their way up, that are, you know, at those director, or you know, in the studio system, right? A director, manager, director, executive, VP, whatever, right? There are a few that we know of. I don't want to out them yet, but they are getting there, but they're not at that place of being true decision makers yet. Right. And I think you're absolutely right. Until we have, you know, ourselves as the gatekeepers, you know, ourselves as who is going to be able to greenlight, it's going to take a while to change. I don't know if you had another perspective on that, Chase, and some of the stuff that you're pitching lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of opinions on the question. And, you know, maybe I'll just start by saying I think this is why it's so important for us to keep making our own work and to not be oriented toward a kind of hierarchy that requires a kind of, but what about me? But what about us? But what about me? But what about us? Because it sacrifices the incredible potential of some of the content and some of the stories that need to be made. And I think that, you know, we run into a problem when diversity is about, oh, well, we need to put more people of color in this story or more trans people in the story. But if you're not thinking critically about the structural apparatus, or you're not writing about the experiences of people of color or the experiences of trans and queer people from a grounded, knowing, embodied state, then you're reproducing all of the problems of patriarchy and white supremacy that we already exist in. And so I think that's where, if you're moving in different spaces, you know, you can be staying really true and really clear while recognizing that the mainstream is a place that some of us want to be, and that there are interesting stories to be told, and that money does help in a lot of different ways, but to be always thinking in more than one place.
No, that is absolutely right. And I think, you know, we're also talking about, you know, who has the privilege to do that, you know, and who has the ability to do that. You just hit on something that points me to another question that I had, and I open this up to anyone and opinions on this. What, if any, do you think will be the Elliot Page effect of his coming out? You know, because I think there's a lot of opinions on that, and how do you think it will affect, you know, the ability for more of us to tell the stories that we want to tell, and to have some of those funded at whatever level we want? So, you know, I'm not saying it's better or worse, or, you know, receiving any of our trans siblings, but I don't know, you think that's going to affect anything as far as from the actor side, Marquise? I know it's a loaded question. I recognize that.
You know, just throw my black ass right in the frying pan. I think there's parts of me that feel like, with someone who is Elliot Page and has such a successful career, I think there could be pluses to that. I think there could be pros in the way that stories could be looked at, and whether or not folks are willing to continue to invest. I must admit, you know, there's parts of me that are kind of like, I'm a little unclear here. Like, I don't know exactly what that will look like, because I acknowledge that, one, we have to be transparent, and I have to be pretty honest about that. Like, that kind of notoriety and fame and success, as somebody who's white, whose, you know, proximity to privilege is very real. I'm not sure about what that means for me, right? If you're saying, as an actor, as a Black trans actor, I don't know what that means for me. And I really don't know what that means for Black trans actors. I know that in looking at what took place, again, as I just mentioned, I mean, Brian Michael Smith has made history, and we're having a conversation about Elliot Page. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be a conversation. It is interesting to me that it's not a yes and. So I don't really know, but I do kind of feel like when you have someone who has that kind of like mega stardom or success, who also happens to have the layers of transness, who is able to be engaged in a conversation with someone like Oprah, maybe there could be some positive things that come out of that. But I think it's all just kind of trial and error. I honestly don't really know. Right, like I'm waiting to see what's going to happen. I think very similarly as I think we all are.
Yeah, well, I think what you're hitting at is the existing stardom and fame that he was coming from, right? And you're looking at someone, you know, as talented as Brian Michael, who has been doing the work for a long time, right? He is not an overnight sensation, like we know that, and he is not getting, to your point, that recognition of, you know, having been a trailblazer in his own right. And in some ways, it's almost been more risky for him, right, than it will be for someone like Elliot Page. And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think that's some of what I'm hearing. And I think that is, you know, at the heart of that moment. And I think more, you know, I ask you that question as an actor, but also for any of the creatives in the room, you know, when you do see somebody of that quote unquote fame level, who has been working in the business as long as someone like Elliot has, in addition to Brian Michael, but a series regular, like we're seeing these stories now with trans MASC folks, trans men who are starting to be part of the narrative and not just a side character. Do any of y'all feel like that is going to change the landscape, or do you think it goes back to what Amos was saying earlier about not having the executives in the space? And these are questions I'm asking myself as someone pitching my own work, you know, and somebody out there trying to get a variety of stories told. And yes, you know, you do make your own work and stories, but there is, you know, if you want to be a working creative in this space, it's still trying to just keep pushing through. And maybe it's too soon to know with the Elliot of it all.
I want to just tap in real quick, if that's okay. I'm not really sure, but I really found what Marquise was saying to be really, really insightful and important, and I completely agree. There's a huge conversation about privilege and about race. There's also a huge conversation there about perceived cisness to like attain that level of success, right? And like for me, I'm just like, I don't see, you know, I think it's amazing. I think it's important that there's more representation in whatever way we can get. And I also feel like in a way, actors in their career that have always been coming from a transmasculine or trans narrative that aren't achieving this level of success or recognition at all, not a part of the conversation at all. There's a question of, race, privilege, but I think there's a huge question of perceived cisness and attaining that level of fame and success from that place, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does indeed. And I think that goes back to maybe what you were talking about earlier, Chase, of showing, you know, a community of folk in front of the screen instead of zeroing in on one experience. Is that also part of that? And how you designed, you know, like you weren't setting out, you weren't setting out to actually cast Billy Tipton, right? It was part of that, you know, experience.
Right, exactly. And I think to connect the conversation to the one we're just having, you know, what happens when you remove your attention from the individual and start spending more time thinking about structures and systems? So for me, the kind of more urgent question is, what does it mean to be in a media landscape that not too long ago treated trans people as spectacles and now arrives them on the same talk show stage to treat them as heroes? We're not that far away. And so I think spending more time with, you know, how race, gender, and class conspire in these circumstances and on these platforms is really where we're going to start to do some of those works. And it's not about one particular body or one particular person or one particular time. And I think, to your point, Jett, I do think, you know, collaboration is the future. I think like moving as a cohort, moving in conversation, creating more complex stories where transness cannot be collapsed onto one body or one person or one experience means that we're going to open up new pathways for understanding.
Yeah, and having more trans folks in those decision-making places, and also in the writer's room. You know, I happen to be in a very lucky situation right now where I am not the only trans person in the writer's room. You know, there's actually 3 of us, and that is unheard of, you know, for a show that is not about transness. So I think that was done by design by the showrunners that are leading the charge, who happen to be both creatives of color. Again, that is building this new type of way to tell stories. And I see that, you know, in the behind the scenes of what Sam did with Disclosure, what y'all did with No Ordinary Man, of, you know, building that community behind the scenes. And I think that's super important. I want to throw a softball out there for us to bring in some of that joy so that you can also, because not that we're talking about, you know, trauma necessarily, but I think that a lot of us talk about not wanting to, you know, tell the usual trauma tropes and bring in some of our joy and bring in some of our collaborative spirit. But what is on the horizon for each of you that you are excited about right now? What do you want to promote? What do you want to talk about? Because I also feel like that is, where are we going? What do we want to do? What is exciting for us right now? And whatever that looks like. Marquise, you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. So first, May 14th, check out Pride on FX. It's a 6-part documentary or docuseries, excuse me. The episode that I'm in is, of course, directed by none other than Mr. Ford himself, the Oscar winner. So I'm excited about that. Check it out. Outside of that, one in particular project I can't talk about, but the other is a follow-up to The Aggressives, which we've been working on for the last 4 years. I'm EPing that. Hopefully we can be wrapped by the end of the year. I'm really excited about it. So, yeah.
Wow, what year did what year did that come out again? 2000?
It came out in 2005.
Okay, 4 or 5, right.
It came out in 2005. It was filmed from like 1997, I think, until 2001. I mean, it's old. Like,
no, hey, I remember seeing it on the festival circuit, but I think what you're speaking to is, it's like and what you were talking about earlier, Chase, is like, keep making the work, right? And it's like, I've been aware of y'all's work for many years, and Cal, aware of your work this year. But it's like, we've been making this work, and it's been in, our queer or the burgeoning trans festivals for many, many years. And the reason I keep bringing up, the mainstream thing is so that our stories and characters not only continue to be a part of our conversations and a part of us seeing one another, but also for others to continually see us. And so that's what I love about now, even being able to revisit work like that and make the feature that y'all been wanting, make the larger project. I think it's even going to have a much, larger audience than it did before. And to me, that is super exciting, that it's just going to help amplify those stories. I don't know if that sounds, hopeful, but I'm hoping it will.
Fingers crossed.
All right, Amos, what's on deck for you?
Learning how to unmute myself is what's on deck for me. I spent the last almost 2 years writing for the upcoming Gossip Girl that will be on HBO Max. Maybe we remember the original Gossip Girl. This is a whole new.
I'm excited.
Whole new group of youth in New York City. Very different, and so that'll be airing. I believe it's July. I don't know, but this summer, HBO Max. Check it out, binge it, and a bunch of other projects in the scripted world that I can't talk about, but just keep in touch through carrier pigeon, and I'm sure I will send a notification into the universe on whatever project I'm on next that I can talk about.
Hot tip just for everybody in this space. If we were going to follow you on one social media channel to find out the hot tip, which one should we follow of yours?
For me, Instagram is really the only thing. I just posted my first picture since December, but I've
it's a good one. It's good.
Felt cute, got a haircut, so I had to do it. But Instagram is the only thing I do. But I will try. Whenever I have a project going on, I'll definitely blast it there.
Amazing.
Thanks,
Cal. Cal, what's on deck for you?
Oh, I got a lot of secret things I can't talk about, but
you're so Hollywood now. I love it.
No secrets whatsoever. I'm actually a full-time teacher, so I'm just trying to make a little more time to write, and that's been going well. I'm still riding the coattails of my book. It came out in February, so and I'm also maybe a year ago, my partner and I started this organization called Too Hot for Hoodies, born out of the idea that trans masculine people wearing 12 hoodies in the summer is not a thing and doesn't need to be a thing. So we basically rehouse binders and stuff. So we get people donating binders to us, and then we, get intake forms, people who need them, and we send them out. So yeah, just working on that and trying to do what I can for the community and make some space to be creative. And yeah.
I saw one of the designs on your website, and art is activism right there.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you.
And speaking of art as activism, Chase, that's a great segue into some of the amazing work that you have done for over the years. But what are you excited about right now?
I just feel like we should end on Cal's amazing answer, but so I'm going to be brief and then throw it back to the energy of Cal. I'm in post-production on a feature film, Framing Agnes. It's based on a short of the same name, which stars many of our favorite people and is about,
it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so the feature is supercharged, and Jen Richards and Stephen Ira and Jules Gill Peterson join us in the cohort cast. And if all goes according to plan, that will be locked and done by the end of this year. And it's a pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, it's so great. And I recognize that we really just scratched the surface. And I think that, we're starting to have more opportunities to have, to use that umbrella term, trans masculinity as a point of conversation for all of us as storytellers. And, I feel like what's coming across to me and some of the conversations I have and some of the conversation we had here is like, we're really just at the tip of the iceberg of what most of our stories are and the creatives that are coming up. I had a conversation recently with a creative, and they were trying to write a role for a 16-year-old Black trans man. They were like, well, I don't know if we're going to have the talent pool. And I was like, the talent pool is there. The talent pool is there. You can't keep saying that line. And it was still surprising to me that that's being said. But I think, it's all up to us to just keep doing the work, as we've said. And I think one last question I have for each of you. I think I just said this is the last question, but what advice, and any of y'all can go that you want, would you give to up and coming storytellers in general? Like, what was something that maybe you wish you had heard when you were starting out as a storyteller that you think would have helped you?
I'll try. I would say that the greatest story that you could ever tell is your own. And I would say that it's a great place to start, I think, particularly for trans folk, TGNC, non-binary communities. I mean, that is the power that we harness, that we hold, that sometimes we're not even aware of. This sort of idea of like reimagining yourself in a world that doesn't see you, but you see you. I think that's a great place to start.
That's a wonderful place. Chase.
I love that. And pay forward some early advice that I got, which was hang around people who you think are doing really cool and interesting things. It was such an interesting and formative piece of advice for me. It was you like the worlds that those people are making, can you be a part of that world in some way and find your ground there?
Love that.
I'll say, don't be afraid to ask for help from other creative people, friends, potential collaborators, or just have a conversation, a starting point with people, similar to what Chase said.
Nice. And Cal,
probably all
take us home.
Oh, jeez. All right. Probably all in the same vein, I think. My number one thing would be make what isn't there. If you don't see it, then someone's looking for it. But if you make it, someone has it. So, yeah.
I think that is a perfect one to end on. Again, so we got Cal to take us home after all. Thank you all for sharing the space and doing the brilliant work that you all are doing. I know that it's not easy work that we do, but we choose to do it because these stories matter to us. I've heard that come across in different times that y'all have spoken about this and being your true authentic selves. And I think, Marquise, I think that's absolutely right, is being authentic and feeling seen is an important part of the journey for all of us. So thank y'all. Have a great rest of your night. And thank y'all for watching as we continue to make the work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was awesome. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jett.